All right, hello everybody and welcome. This is Anthony Allen here with Save the Sound, CFP Save the Sound. We are very excited to welcome you into another one of our lunchtime webinars. We happen to think that it's the best way to spend your lunch break. We're not biased at all. So today, this is going to be a really special one, folks, because Sunken Meadow State Park and our work out there, this has been our largest ecological restoration project to date, the biggest thing we've undertaken, and you'll see exactly how big that is in this presentation today. So I'm gonna turn it over here to Cary White, who is our Green Infrastructure Project Manager. And Cary's been spending a lot of time recently, especially out on Sunken Meadow. And by the way, in this first slide, this is Sunken Meadow State Park that you see right there. So very beautiful place, really unique place, and one that we were very, very fortunate and happy to have a role in helping to restore. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it on over to Cary.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony, and thanks for all of you who showed up today. Yeah, as Anthony said, this is definitely our biggest restoration project to date. And I was actually looking, I think it's actually one of the biggest, if not the biggest, restoration project to date in Long Island Sound. So a very big deal. We've been involved since 2009 with planning and designs, but a lot of the more intensive construction and implementation has really happened over the past couple of years. So that's what we'll be mainly focusing on that today. Just kind of a brief overview. What you'll see in this presentation are the three main components of the implementation work, which were the Marsh Restoration, the fish passage assessment, and the parking lot green infrastructure retrofit. And I'll just stay on this slide for 1 second just to orient you all to the site. So right now you're looking west down Long Island at Sunken Meadow State Park. On the right is Long Island Sound. On the left, Sunken Meadow Creek. And basically what's all in the foreground and then to the distance is the Sunken Meadow State Park beach. And yeah, you'll be seeing a lot of aerial imagery. So just from different angles. So that creek is and the beach are kind of good reference points. Going back in time a little bit here, this is what the park looked like in the 50s. As you can see, the creek channel is still pretty natural. In the upper left corner, you'll see the parking lots and kind of the early stages of what the park looked like. Moving forward, in the 50s, there was a big expansion of the park and the parking lots, and that led to more channelization of the creek. And then with that eventually culminating in the construction of an earthen berm that ended up blocking most tidal flow into the creek and the estuary and salt marsh system behind it. Yeah, go ahead. This is another look at the berm, and more recently. Flip through this. So yeah, as I said, there was a small culvert at the bottom, but it mostly cut off all saltwater flows to the marsh. Luckily, we had come in kind of around 2009 and done some feasibility studies with a number of environmental partners and federal agencies about what it would take to remove this berm and restore tidal flow. So luckily we'd had all the designs and engineering assessments in place so that when Hurricane Sandy came along, conveniently broke through it for us, we were able to replace, rather than having to replace the berm, we were able to replace it in kind with a pedestrian bridge. You can see in this picture, and the construction of that was funded through New York State Parks. And so, yeah, when this opened up again after Hurricane Sandy, that restored saltwater and tidal flows to about 135 acres of marsh, which began rebounding over the subsequent years. After this happened, there was still a little bit more facilitating to do to facilitate the restoration of the marsh. In particular, there were a couple spots that we targeted for marsh plantings, as the tidal flows really pretty drastically altered the conditions in the marsh. There was some kind of active management that needed to happen. So those included, you'll see in the next slide, is a planting in 2015 and 2016, and then some more extensive work in the past couple of years. I'll say one thing about the Phragmites. So Phragmites, as many of you may know, is an invasive species that had come to dominate the marsh area before the restoration of the tidal flow. And so with the tidal flow restored, the conditions became better for more native species such as Spartina ultimiflora and other species in the high marsh and surrounding areas. So, so part of this was replanting the native plants on some of the mud flats to prevent erosion and to restore the genetic pool of these species in this system. And this is what it looks like today. It's what had kind of been a mud flat has now been restored to a pretty vigorous marsh. And so you see in this picture, this was a little further upstream. This took place in 2018. This is an area where the Phragmites is a little bit more dominant, and its root mat had actually kind of raised the elevation of the marsh, so it required a little bit more technical work to regrade and lower the marsh surface so that those Spartina ultimiflora plants that I spoke about earlier could receive the daily tidal inundation that they needed. So that was removed. This is a picture of that area, still with the Phragmites in place. And yeah, then we, the past couple of years, have led planting efforts to continue to fight back against the Phragmites, and that whole area is really rebounding nicely. This current phase of the work for us wraps up this fall, but the New York State Parks will be continuing to monitor the Phragmites and have crews go out there to cut it back. So that's great. Next component of the project was an assessment of fish passage. So with that big berm broken through and with Hurricane Sandy, as I said, it opened up a lot of areas of marsh for migratory fish to come through. And so we worked with some engineering firm to kind of trace that back to figure out, all right, now that barrier is removed, how can we further expand the ability for fish to migrate and spawn and find habitat further upstream. Yeah, again, it's going back to that berm being replaced, the bridge, restoring fish passage to 135 acres of marsh. And this is a look kind of at the back part of the marsh, and which fish now have access to. And so what we found was a series of 7, actually 8 small weirs from an old fish hatchery that was probably built in like the 30s or something and kind of defunct and in disrepair. So that's really mostly what we were focusing on for this part of the study. What we found was these culverts, these 8 culverts all had some weir boards in them. I think those had a lot of those in disrepair. Yeah, through assessing the situation, looking at the water levels and what sort of habitat we could create, we've concluded that the best action here is actually just to remove the weir boards and create as much fish passability as possible. Yeah, there's one more. Oh yeah, so there's continuing upstream. The next obstacle is a dam that's on private property that we've identified that if we or another organization would like to do future work, that would be something to look into. And then last but not least, for this, the infrastructure work we did on parking field number 2. Stormwater was falling on this and running basically directly into Sunken Meadow Creek, carrying pollutants, sediment, oil from cars, animal waste, all sorts of things that we would not want to be in the water bodies. And the parking field itself was in a little bit of disrepair. It wasn't used. It was used kind of during those peak times during the year, 4th of July. But the park staff was open to doing something creative and with it and beneficial for the environment, which was great. This is what it looks like today. As you can see, much different story. And you with this. This is looking south back towards the creek into the marsh area. And you'll see that the permeable surface has been almost basically cut in half. And in the foreground, there's what had once been parking lot was turned into a large picnic area. At the top of the screen, you'll see these 2 constructed wetlands, which we'll touch on in a second. And then on the right-hand side is the bioswale portion of the parking lot, which we'll look at in the next slides. So these are a series of 8 bioswales installed next to the pavilion, which is kind of their wedding venue area. So these bioswales were, the way they work is the asphalt all around them is pitched to direct water directly into them rather than into catch basins and into the storm sewer system. And they kind of have a bit of a depression, so they're able to hold and infiltrate the water, and the plants are able to absorb any nutrients, and yeah, again, just preventing any of these unwanted pollutants from entering the water bodies. And they're filled with native plants that provide habitat for pollinators and other sorts of critters. At the top of the screen here are the 2 constructed wetlands, which manage the stormwater from those 2 central parking lots. They kind of serve a couple of functions. I mean, they reduce the total amount of impermeable surface, but they're also, like I said, collecting stormwater from the rest of the parking lot. And they're similar in theory to the bioswales, but on a much bigger scale. And they're designed to capture the stormwater, slowly infiltrate it, and create a habitat for other species. Yeah, again, the rest of the parking lot's pitched and flow into them. Again, just to reiterate, all this is preventing the stormwater from flowing into the marsh and further enhancing the recovery of that marsh. Some great before and after pics. We're lucky to have some great drone footage from Dr. Becky Grella, who's helped us out with this project. Yes, this is very cool. A little video, seeing the parking lot. This was taken just a few weeks ago, so you can see some of the newly planted areas of marsh. Yeah, very exciting stuff. Yeah, and then just moving on to some of the impact here, getting down some numbers. So this project has restored over 4 acres of wetland through direct planting and invasive species removal. Of that 4 acres, I believe 1.5 acres were from actual marsh creation, which is from that excavation that we showed earlier. Yeah, regrading. And yeah, as said earlier, the removal of that berm itself opened up 135 acres to better tidal flows, the reconstruction of the parking lot, improve the water quality, and yeah, that amounts to about 135 acres of full-on restoration. Parking lot, yeah, again, 16.6 acres, 50% reduction in the total impermeable surface. All that water now is being treated and prevented from reaching the Sunken Meadow Creek. Yes, that actually ends up being millions, actually, 3 million gallons of stormwater a year will be captured and treated through these green infrastructure practices. In addition to the restoration work, we've also been busy with a lot of other stuff at Sunken Meadow State Park, education and outreach efforts. This was a touch tank that we supported, where we had a volunteer out there for summer going around interacting with park visitors and kind of allowing them to pick up some of the things that they might find in the creek or in Long Island Sound. We had a number of volunteer events, cleanups, water quality, sampling, plantings, and yeah, very excitingly, we put together, with the help of a designer, 4 great educational signs that will be installed around the new parking lot to further educate park visitors on what they're seeing, what these changes are for, and how it all relates to the surrounding ecology. So that's great. It's a very, very beloved and highly visited park. So that's again, we have millions of people annually coming to see all that. These are some of the signs: bioswales, the constructed wetlands, Marsh Restoration,
So this is Anthony, and I'm just going to jump in for a second to say, several of the species that are on this sign, specifically salt marsh sparrow, they're highly endangered, and specifically with the salt marsh sparrow, they're in danger of disappearing altogether because of the retreat of marshes. And so one of the things that of salt marshes, I should say, and one of the things that is potentially possible here in this situation, now that the berm has been removed, is that the marsh may actually be able to migrate and move inland a bit as the sea level rises. And so that's something that we're interested in learning more about, and certainly we'll keep an eye on.
Yeah, and so then this is the final map, or the final sign that gives an overview of all the work that's been done in the marsh and the parking lot. Yeah, thank you all for being here, and definitely happy to answer any questions you might have, open things up a bit.
Yeah. All right, so we do have a few questions coming in. Thanks, everyone. And thank you, Cary. So first, Jim asks, is parking lot runoff the only source of the hydrology sustaining the wetland basins, or does seasonal groundwater discharge also play a role?
That's a great question. Yeah, there definitely are some freshwater flows into the salt marsh up around those culverts and weirs that I was talking about. That's a freshwater stream, but yeah, most of it's maintained by the tidal flows. So a lot of these photos that you're seeing here are probably taken around high tide, but at low tide, the water in the marsh really reduces to a pretty narrow channel.
William asks, he said, it must be extremely permitting intensive exercise to alter a marsh or wetland, even if benefiting it. Yes. Did Save the Sound undertake that work? Any interesting highlights to summarize?
Yeah, yeah, that is a great question, and that definitely speaks to, I think, how time intensive some of this work has been, because there are numerous rounds of designs and permitting that had to go through before we could even plant on, or much less excavate parts of the marsh, or we're going to regrade parts of the marsh. So yeah, I personally wasn't involved in the permitting aspect, but that was mostly something that we had to contract out to engineering firms that had real specialized skill in that permitting process.
Yeah, you will notice that, when we do these timelines, and when Cary was discussing the marsh restoration work in particular, there was some of it that happened 2015, 2016, and then there was a gap, right? There was a gap until about 2018, and that was a lot of planning work going into that, designs for the parking lot phase of the project. So it can take a little while, but it's definitely worth it when you see this kind of result come at the end of it. All right, back to Jim. Thanks for the questions, Jim. Jim asks, is there an overall reduction in the number of parking spaces in the park? If not, where was additional parking provided? And if no additional parking was made available, how was the park convinced to reduce overall parking?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. I don't have the numbers, but I believe there was an overall reduction. Although I think there was, in the areas where parking remained, the spaces were used a little bit more efficiently than they had been in the past. Luckily, I think a lot of, we got lucky in a lot of ways with this, in that that particular parking field, as I said, wasn't as used. It was mainly only for the high traffic times of year, and the park has a number of other parking fields. There's parking field 2, I think there's 5 total that are roughly this size. So they were able to have some flexibility in the amount of parking spaces they have, which was great.
And now I'm sorry if I butcher this name, Liza. What's next? How are the successes and lessons learned during this project informing other Save the Sound initiatives? Thank you for that question.
Yeah, yeah, it's a great question, and timely question, as we're undergoing our strategic planning right now. I think there's been a huge learning experience for the organization. As I said, the biggest restoration project to date. In terms of what's next for this project, it's kind of transitioning over into Parks hands right now. We'll be running a workshop with the Parks maintenance staff on how to take care of the green infrastructure pieces, the bioswales, the constructed wetlands, what they need to look for to make sure it's all operating properly. There could be additional work to be done in the, as I said, upstream for fish passage, looking at maybe some other barriers to fish migration upstream. Let's see, yeah, the parks is also, as I said, they'll continue with the kind of working to fight back against some of the invasive species in the marsh.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I would add a couple things sort of more generally. I think this being such a large scale project, but then also in such a unique location. I know one of the challenges in this project that we came up against was a really shallow depth to groundwater. And so it was a learning experience for the whole team in terms of working within a very broad project, multi-stakeholder project, and sort of adjusting the plans when you run up against things that you didn't expect, where normally we might have tried to just go with permeable pavers in a place like this. We had to adjust, and that's where constructed wetlands came into play and that kind of thing. So we were, as Cary said, fortunate to have Parks as such a flexible partner in this. And I would also say, I believe, so one of our upcoming projects that should be starting soon is a dam removal, which is actually up the Nissequag, right? Yeah. So in the first slide, and let me see if I can run back to that. It's going to take a while. So I want you to be able to see the Nissequag. There you go. So out where Sunken Meadow Creek comes around and meets up with the sound, that's also the area where the mouth of the Nissequag River is. And so in terms of fish passage, we're going to be doing a dam removal up the Nissequag River. So still working within this same system, the same area. And Cary, I don't know if you want to say any more about that, but
yeah, and a big thing there is also working with probably some of the same folks at New York State Parks that we've already formed a great relationship with and working partnership with. So it's been a huge benefit of this project to form those relationships.
Yeah. So thank you for that question. There's a lot of work to be done, and we always look at these projects as part of the systems or the natural systems and how we're helping those systems to heal. So it's never one and done with us. We're taking some time to certainly celebrate this project and everyone who helped make it possible. But we are ready to start the next one too. So final question from Mark. Is there monitoring or anecdotal evidence of fish migration and spawning up creek?
Yes, there is some anecdotal evidence. We did not have the funding to do a full-on fish survey. But yeah, there has been some anecdotal evidence of alewife, at least seen in the creek. But as for spawning, our kind of the conclusion we came to was because it was such a tidally influenced system, and a lot of the spawning fish that we were looking to target, like the Americas, the alewife, they require like very freshwater spots to spawn in. So we can create habitat for them to move up and down the river, the creek, but spawning may be a little bit more limited in this particular system.
Great. All right. Well, really appreciate everyone joining us for this. Thank you again, Cary, for leading us through this. And thank you to everyone who supports this organization in any way, because it all comes together in projects like this. And together we're able to really make some transformative change, which I think is what you've seen here. So keep following the work. We're going to keep doing it. And this recording will also be posted, so you can share it around. All right, folks. Hope everyone has a great day, and thanks again for joining.
Thanks, guys.